Hi, Wayne Ammons here. If you have been following this series of broadcasts, you have seen many examples when American leadership has pushed Israel to give up parts of her sacred land and the immediate disastrous consequences. Today's broadcast will present facts as to how President Donald J. Trump's administration treated Israel from 2017 to 2021, as well as predictions of future events based on Bible scriptures. You see, there are hundreds of prophecies and promises in the Bible, many of which have already happened. Let's begin by looking at Genesis 12th chapter, 3rd verse. I challenge anyone to name an individual or nation that the scripture you just read has not come to pass, good or bad, depending on how they have treated Israel. This book survived throughout centuries, and more copies have been distributed throughout the world than any other book. And yes, it is the Bible. If you have questions about how to have life and have it more abundantly, go to this manual, the Bible. In my previous broadcast, I have encouraged listeners to research and verify truth for themselves. The information you will be hearing is true, but it is important that you verify it for yourself. Don't trust hearsay and gossip, and by all means be wary of mainstream media. They have been distorting and even camouflaging facts for years. Seek truth for yourself, and you will find it. Donald J. Trump was inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States on January 20th, 2017. He yielded his 2020 election to former Vice President Joe Biden. Mr. Trump's presidential campaign and administration boasted of his impressive business acumen while referring to his not being a politician. His Make America Great Again and Drain the Swamp slogans and unequivocal support for Israel was never in doubt. Likewise, one either loved Donald Trump or hated him, and very few were in the middle. The entire Democratic Party and mainstream media expressed a visceral hatred for Mr. Trump. Despite relentless attacks from both of these sources, his administration achieved much that hardly anyone thought possible, especially under such duress. And as with other presidential administrations, America was either blessed or not as she treated Israel. Some of President Trump's relations with Israel are categorized and elaborated on as follows. Let's look at President Trump's initial actions. The Trump administration repeatedly expressed commitment to take a friendlier approach toward Israel than previous administrations. Just 2 days after his inauguration on January 20th, he phoned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss the Iran nuclear issue, as well as the regional threat of ISIS. Within 6 months, that's May 2017, Trump met with Netanyahu in Israel. On December 6, 2017, President Trump announced the United States official recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The U.S. Embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The move came 23 years after the passage of the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which had set a deadline of May 31st, 1999 for the move. However, the Clinton-Bush-Obama administration had deferred the move. If you have heard some of my broadcasts, you realize how the United Nations has singled out Israel for condemnation while turning a blind eye to some of the world's worst human rights violators. The Trump administration wasted no time sending a message to the UN that the United States would no longer tolerate its ally, Israel, being treated so irrationally. While other U.S. administrations had often protested the absurdity of the UN's resolutions against Israel, the Trump administration decided to actually take action. And on January 16, 2018, the administration drastically reduced funding to the UNRWA, that's Relief and Works Agency, as punishment for the UN's absurd positions. Barack Obama, Trump's predecessor, was successful in spearheading a joint agreement between Russia, China, Great Britain, France, Germany, and the European Union regarding an Iran nuclear program. While Iran insisted its nuclear program was peaceful, the world remains skeptical, especially Israel. You see, the nation of Iran had previously and openly promised to one day wipe Israel off the map. And while the Obama administration flaunted the Iran nuclear deal as the good deal that we solved, the new Trump administration viewed it as, in the words of Trump, one of the worst deals I've ever witnessed. Trump's reasoning included Iran's covert program, a sunset clause where many nuclear restrictions would be lifted in 10, 15, or 25 years, the failure to inspect sensitive military sites, the failure to include ballistic missiles as part of the agreement, and sanctions relief that meant the Iranian government would receive a boom of between $50 to $150 billion. Some called this last reason as a, quote, jihadist stimulus plan, end quote. In February 2017, the Trump administration announced that the U.S. would be withdrawing from the nuclear deal and sanctions against Iran would be reinstated. With only a few months into his presidency, Donald Trump's favorable support for Israel was becoming even more vividly clear. One of the very clear signs became known as the deal of the century for peace between Israel and surrounding Arab neighbors. The agreement was named the Abraham Accords. We will hear more about the Abraham Accords peace treaty in a few minutes. There is no doubt that the Trump's administration's favorable actions toward Israel truly dwarfed those of his immediate predecessors. In addition, President Trump took a stance on several domestic issues that greatly offended the Democratic Party and mainstream media. His positions regarding abortion, same-sex marriage, law enforcement, illegal immigration, border control, and other issues were undoubtedly within the core of the animosity against him. His "Made America Great" and "Drain the Swamp" slogans were hated by the aforementioned groups. The visceral hatred from the Democratic Party and the mainstream media increased to a boiling point, and millions of dollars were spent surrounding an ill-contrived dossier that accused President Trump of collusion with Russia. There were relentless accusations of a scandal between the president and Ukraine. Sex scandals were also thrown at the president, while other accusations targeted members of his family. Countless hours and multiple thousands of tax dollars were invested by his enemies to downplay his credibility and effectiveness. There were efforts to impeach him before he ever set foot in the White House, and even after his presidential term had ended. And this latter effort was to prevent him from ever being allowed to serve as president again. It has been said that if President Trump had been instrumental in finding a cure for all types of cancer and heart disease, his involvement would have been downplayed by the Democratic Party leadership and mainstream media, while criticizing Trump's failure to find a cure for the common cold. Indeed, Donald Trump's 4-year term as President of the United States was quite a tumultuous time in American history. A highly contested 2020 presidential election resulted with former Vice President Joe Biden entering the White House. There are still investigations of fraud and international interference in the November 2020 election, not only for the presidential office, but for U.S. nationwide offices as well. And only with time and more investigations will the truth about these elections be known. With President Trump's accomplishments, there was no doubt of his self-confidence, which translated by many as arrogant and condescending. He was quick to remind everyone of how much he had accomplished. It would have been better had he acknowledged God's favor toward him and our nation, as our founding fathers had done. I'm reminded of Proverbs 3rd chapter, 5th and 6th verse. Perhaps Donald Trump was, and is, just another leader used by God, as was King Cyrus to help Israel thousands of years ago. You can find this in the Bible. God is clear, however, that he hates a prideful heart. Let's look at just one of many scriptures that makes this point. It's found in Proverbs 8th chapter and 13th verse. As mentioned earlier, let's revisit the topic of Abraham Accords peace treaty. And first, let me challenge you again with the question asked at the start of this broadcast. Can you name any nation or individual that disproves Genesis 12:3? You see, God's promises from Genesis is for nations as well as individuals. It is undeniable that America has been blessed while being a friend to Israel. As verified in other broadcasts of this series, however, disasters have hit America at precisely the same time she has coerced Israel to give up parts of her God-given land to her enemies. From economic, ethical, and humanitarian perspectives, the Abraham Accords was a phenomenal achievement. And also, rather than the U.S. coercing Israel to yield portions of her God-given land to enemy nations in efforts to gain peace, a strategy that has never worked for 30-plus years, the Trump administration convinced the Arabs and the Israelis of the positive benefits of sharing technology, science, medicine, tourism, and other normalization topics, including worshiping the God of their choice. Now, for several years, only the Arab nations of Egypt, 1979, and Jordan, 1994, had officially declared peace with Israel. Now, notice that their declaration of peace did not necessarily call for normalization, as described a moment ago. But with the Abraham Accords, other Arab nations agreed to interact with Israel and vice versa, much in the same way that the U.S. interacts with Canada, Europe, and so on. At the time of this broadcast, the Arab countries that have agreed to this normalization are the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Other Arab countries are evaluating doing the same, including Mauritania, Oman, Indonesia, and even Saudi Arabia. It is important to understand that the religion of the Arab nation is Islam, and their God is Allah. Now, ever since her Declaration of Independence in 1776, the religion of America has been predominantly Christianity, and our God has been Yahweh. Likewise, the God of Israel is Yahweh, although their religion is essentially Judaism. The Islamic Faith is comprised of two primary branches, the Sunnis and the Shiites. Even these two branches have multiple branches. There is, and has been for centuries, much civil unrest between these branches. This was foretold in the Bible thousands of years ago when Yahweh, God, made promises to Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, Abraham's handmaiden. God promised blessings to the Arab people, Ishmael's descendants, but Hagar was also told, "He will be a wild donkey of the man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." Now, regarding the Abraham Accords, we should look at even more places in the Bible, such as Hosea, Jeremiah, Daniel, Matthew, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Revelation. You see, God wants us to know His plans. It's in this book, the Bible. With time restrictions for this broadcast, let's simply refer to the 38th and 39th chapters of the book of Ezekiel. We realize that shortly before Jesus Christ returns to earth, Israel will have removed their walls of protection, that is, their defense systems, while becoming disillusioned with a sense of peace, safety, and security after committing, in the Bible, quote, fornication with the harlot of Babylon, end quote. It is interesting that Egypt, referred to as Sheba in the Bible, and the Arabian Peninsula, referred to as Dedan, are not included, but are named with Israel's allies that will be decimated. This period is referred to as time of Jacob's troubles and leads to the abomination of desolation. Think about this. Could the Abraham Accords normalization initiative be setting the stage for Israel's false sense of peace, safety, and security? Could visceral resentment and hatred occur between the Shiite and Sunni Muslims as a result of segregated normalization with Israel? Is it conceivable that Russia, seemingly referred to as Gog in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, would pursue leading a holy war in order to gain wealth and power through normalized economic scenarios in the Middle East? America, where to from here? You may have seen from earlier broadcasts in this series that every U.S. president since Jimmy Carter in 1997 has ambitiously tried to arbitrate lasting peace in the Middle East. But again, with the exception of the Trump administration, these efforts have involved Israel giving up parts of her God-given land to her enemies, and then paralleled devastation to the U.S. at the same exact time. With such parallel events, one is hard-pressed to deny God's promises in Genesis 12th chapter, 3rd verse. The facts are, however, that during the last 2 years of President Trump's administration, several devastating wildfires and hurricanes resulted in America. The 2017 Thomas Fire in Ventura County was California's largest modern wildfire, only to be surpassed by the Mendocino Ranch Fire in 2018. The devastation was horrendous. 3 costly hurricanes occurred in 2017. Harvey hit southeastern Texas, Irma hit mainland Florida, and Maria hit the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. In 2018, Michael hit Central Florida, and Florence hit the Carolinas. So one may question why catastrophes continued to hit America during the Trump administration, as he was considered by many as one of the most pro-Israel U.S. presidents ever. We should never forget that America was founded on biblical principles, and never doubt that when God says something, He means it. And while God, Yahweh, is loving, patient, when a nation of people continuously turns their backs on God, there are severe consequences. And this happened to the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. It is happening to America today. The Bible is filled with God's yearning for us to trust Him and obey His precepts so we can have abundant life. Now, to find answers to questions about the Trump administration a moment ago, as well as what can be expected for America in the future, you should listen to Part B of this broadcast. It is the most important segment of this 7-part series. This is Wayne Ammons helping you find truth, and I hope you will discover it for yourself. May God bless you.